Good evening. Welcome to the Bildner Center. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the director of the Bildner Center and a professor in the political science doctoral program here at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. This is the first Bildner Center event of the 24-25 academic year, and I'm thrilled to be here with you and with this distinguished panel. The late historian Elizabeth Dore spent 20 years directing Cuban Voices, a Ford Foundation-sponsored oral history project collecting memories. Please keep in mind that there will be no noise, no sound in the the Zoom recording if you do not stand very close to the microphone. So thank you for the reminder. I apparently was just a little too far away. The late historian Elizabeth Dore spent the last 20 years directing Cuban Voices, a Ford Foundation-sponsored oral history project collecting memories of the Cuban Revolution. In 2023, Duke University Press published her posthumous book, How Things Fall Apart: What Happened to the Cuban Revolution, which tells modern Cuba's story through the lives of 7 islanders from the post-Soviet generation. The 15-year project, which involved a large team of Cuban interviewers and over 100 interviewees, faced many challenges, including difficulty finding a publisher for Dore's controversial findings. The ghost of Oscar Lewis kept me awake at night, she notes Riley in her book's opening pages. Following Dore's death in 2022, her children donated the project archive to Columbia University, where it is now digitally available to the public. A lifelong socialist and principled scholar, Dore was dedicated to hearing diverse, critical, and often contradictory Cuban voices, describing the revolution's challenges, rewards, and dilemmas. Her book captures the voices of those who built, supported, opposed, and even fled the revolution. This initial panel, the first of 3 inspired by Dore's work, will focus on Dore's personal and political history and intellectual legacy. An analysis of Things Fall Apart, and an introduction of Columbia's Cuban Voices oral history project by the archivist who prepared it for public access. We have with us tonight a distinguished panel. Our first presenter is Brooke Larson. She is a professor emerita at Stony Brook University, is a social historian of the Andean region. She has written and co-edited several books, including Cochabamba 1550 to 1900, Colonialism and Agrarian Transformation in the Bolivian Andes, published by Duke University Press in 1998. Trials of Nation-Making, Liberalism, Race, and Ethnicity in the Andes, published by Cambridge University Press in 2004. And most recently, The Lettered Indian, Race, Nation, and Indigenous Education in 20th Century Bolivia, published by Duke in 2024. Brooke, or Professor Larson, was a lifelong friend and colleague of Elizabeth Dore, and she joins us tonight to pay tribute to Liz's extraordinary life, work, and intellectual legacy. We also have with us Ted Henken, who organized this panel. Ted received his PhD from Tulane University. He is a colleague of mine at Brooke College, which is the other hat that I wear here in the university, and where he is a professor in sociology and anthropology. He has conducted sociological research on Cuba and interviewed numerous Cubans over the past 25 years. Based on this extensive research, he has published several books, articles, and policy profiles, including Cuba's Digital Revolution, Citizens, Innovation, and State Policy, published in 2021 and co-edited with Sarah Garcia Santamaria, and also Entrepreneurial Cuba, The Changing Policy Landscape, published in 2015. We have with us Flor Barceló, who is a PhD student in Latin American and Iberian cultures at Columbia University. They hold a licenciatura from the University of Buenos Aires, where they concentrated on literary theory. Since 2015, Flor has worked as a high school teacher and a community college professor. Their research interests include the construction of queer archives, do-it-yourself publications, magazines, and fanzines produced by LGBT plus activists from Latin America and Spain, Subjectivity and Grievable Lives Under Neoliberalism, and Literature Written During the AIDS Epidemics. Flor interned at Columbia's Rare Book and Manuscript Library during the summer of 2023, where she processed the interviews that led to Elizabeth Dore's book, How Things Fall Apart. Our discussant tonight is Maria A. Cabrera Arus, who studies the impact, a professor at New York University, who studies the impact of fashion and domestic material culture on regime stability and legitimization with a focus on socialist regimes and the Caribbean region during the Cold War. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Theory and Society, Visual Studies, Cuban Studies, and in anthologies, including the Oxford University Book of Communist Visual Cultures and The Revolution from Within, published by Duke University Press in 2019. She is the author of a multi-award project, Cuba Material, a digital archive of Cuban material culture from the Cold War, and is curator or co-curator on various exhibitions. I would also like to especially welcome here tonight Elizabeth Dore's children, Rachel and Matt Weeks Dore, who are here tonight with us, and we are delighted to have them here. Thank you for being here. So I will leave it at that, and I will turn it over to Brooke. I will take care of that. Thank you. I will turn it over to Brooke, and I will also then turn it over to Ted for his presentation, but also Ted to chair the panel.
You can dive right in. I hope the water's fine.
I'm sure it is. You want the water?
Yeah, you may need yours, right?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. As you may have heard, I am an interloper here. I am not a Cuban expert. I am instead a lifelong friend of Liz Dore, colleague, fellow traveler in the art and craft of Latin American history and historiography. And this is just a brief meditation that can hardly do justice to her life and work, but in the 15 minutes I have, I will make an attempt. And I hope I don't cry, but if I do, you'll just have to overlook it. Elizabeth Dore, a lifelong friend, colleague, and activist scholar, finally succumbed to cancer at her home in London on May 5th, 2022. She left this world fighting against multiple illnesses, a battle she waged so she could live long enough to bring her oral history project to fruition. Burdened by pain, sedated by painkillers, and with only days to live, Liz, as she preferred to be known, met with her editors in her home to put the final touches on the book project to which she had devoted the past 20 years of her life. This final act of courage was emblematic of her lifelong commitment to progressive scholarship and revolutionary ideals, particularly with regard to Latin America. Her remarkable life journey took her, often in the company of her late partner, John Weeks, to Peru, Nicaragua, Cuba, Chile, and various regions of England and the United States. Born in Brooklyn to parents of Jewish descent, Liz came of political age during the late 1960s. After graduating from Vassar College in 1967, she returned home to New York City and got a job as an assistant editor at Random House. By day, she perused manuscripts, met with writers, and carried cups of coffee to her cigar-smoking boss. By night, Liz plunged into radical politics, joining the Revolutionary Communist Party, demonstrating against the Vietnam War, and doing anti-racism work for the Black Panthers. Ultimately, Liz strove to temper her radical street politics with pragmatic electoral strategies, including her work on John Lindsay's mayoral campaign. Eventually, however, Liz was drawn back into academia, where she would have space to read and think about the political causes she was fighting for. She enrolled in Tufts University program in Russian studies, but eventually soured on the prospect of specializing on the Soviet Union's morbid Cold War politics. By contrast, resurgent revolutionary movements in Cuba, Chile, Central America exercised a powerful attraction, as did local movements against Cold War politics and US imperialism in Latin America. So after a year at Tufts, Liz came back to New York City, where she walked into Herbert Klein's office in Columbia University's history department and made a powerful case as to why she should be admitted into the PhD program to study Latin American history, although she still had little formal background in the field and only a primitive command of Spanish. Of course, that would quickly change. It was there that I first encountered the intrepid Liz Dore, who soon became my graduate school soulmate. Although the 1968 student uprisings were over, Columbia was still a hotbed of student activism, and the Upper West Side, of course, a playground of leftist politics, Marxist intellectuals, and funky therapists. Marxist study groups were cropping up everywhere, and Liz ventured forth into that world, studying the Marxist canon with a circle of comrades while she was finishing up her coursework at Columbia. While reading Das Kapital, she decided to ditch her original dissertation project in order to study a topic of contemporary political relevance. She settled on a research plan of study to study the historical roots of economic backwardness in Peru's mining industry, a politicized topic she chose against the advice of her professors who worried about her future job prospects. So in 1974, Liz set out to do the archival research. She moved to Peru with her partner, the economist John Weeks, who launched his own study of Peruvian economic crisis. And together they became involved in leftist politics in Lima, while engaging in a range of theoretical debates about the structural causes of underdevelopment, the distorted nature of dependent capitalism, and the bankruptcy of state policy. From their different disciplinary vantage points, Dore and Weeks advanced the Leninist thesis that only the driving force of class struggle at the point of mining production would liberate Peru's extractive economy from the scourge of pre-capitalist forms of labor oppression and structural backwardness. Meanwhile, their apartment in downtown Lima became a watering hole for Peruvian leftists and an international cohort of comrades who streamed through the city, often en route to Bolivia or Chile. Over the next few years, Liz and Johnny published articles, often jointly authored, that appeared in the pages of Latin American Perspectives, NACLA, Monthly Review, and other progressive journals. And eventually, Liz transformed her dissertation into a book. It was entitled The Peruvian Mining Industry, Growth, Stagnation, and Crisis. And it was published in 2 editions, Westview in 1988 and Routledge in 2019. Latin America's shifting cartography of revolutionary activity soon beckoned, however. In 1981, Liz and Johnny left Peru for Nicaragua, where they joined the new Sandinista government as policy consultants. Liz worked for the Nicaraguan Ministry of Information, where she focused on the Sandinistas' agrarian reform program. John lent his expertise to the Ministry of Finance. It must have been a glorious time to put their scholarly capital to work for a young, hopeful revolutionary cause. During their time in Nicaragua, the revolutionary regime was still young. Sandinista socialism was vibrant, and Managua's intellectual and cultural life was exciting. Nicaragua seemed to be avoiding many of the mistakes that Cuban policy's hardliners had committed. But by 1983 and 1984, the political climate was starting to deteriorate. The Iran-Contra war was escalating. Government work was riven by sectarian policy debates. Economic shortages were acute, and civilian life was fraught. After some soul-searching, Liz and John, with their toddler twins in tow, decided to repatriate. They settled in Washington, where Johnny took a position in the economics department of American University, while Liz briefly worked for the Chilean program of the Inter-American Foundation. Yet Liz's scholarly relationship to Nicaragua continued to deepen over the next few years. While working in the Sandinista Information Ministry, she had quietly carved out a new research project. This time, she would investigate the history of agrarian class relations in the Nicaraguan region of Granada during the height of the coffee boom between 1870 and 1930. Through this project, I think Liz fully realized her potential as a social historian by bringing the tools of gender analysis and oral history methods to bear on classic Marxist questions of agrarian class relations. Dore's regional history of Granada exposed the deep and tangled roots of peonage, property, and patriarchy, the same issues that had challenged the Sandinistas as they had tried to orchestrate agrarian reform and promote gender equality during the 1980s. In her second book, entitled The Myths of Modernity, Peonage and Patriarchy in Nicaragua, 1870 to 1930, Liz argued that the country's export-oriented coffee boom had reinforced the patriarchal structures of power, both at the top and the bottom of the agrarian class hierarchy. As Liz's research took her deep into the gendered history of rural Nicaragua, it also opened transnational horizons of gender analysis and theory. She became active in critiquing sectarian Marxist theories that insisted on privileging the determinism of political economy over sociocultural issues of gender, politics, and consciousness. Once back in the United States and later in England, Liz took her feminist crusade on the road by organizing conferences and publishing collected volumes, including the edited book, Gender Politics in Latin America, Debates in Theory and Practice, published by Monthly Review in 1997, and her collected volume, Hidden Histories of Gender and the State in Latin America, co-edited with Maxine Molinier in the year 2000 by Duke. By 2000, Liz and Johnny had once again upended their roots and resettled their family, this time moving from the woods of northern Vermont to the city of London. Having reluctantly given up her tenure-track job at Middlebury, Liz soon found academic appointments in the south of England, first at Portsmouth and later at Southampton University. Not long settled in England, Liz stumbled onto an opportunity to realize a research project that she could only have dreamed about during her earlier years abroad. It promised to take her back to Cuba for the first time since her brief but eye-opening trip there in 1974. And it was then that the seeds for the oral history project were first planted. In the preface to her new book, How Things Fall Apart, she briefly recalls how the Cuban Voices project practically fell into her lap, and this really is a researcher's Cinderella story. At an international conference on women in Latin America, a Ford Foundation officer, obviously somebody who was scouting for some good funding ideas to take back to her office in Mexico City, turned to her seatmate and asked Liz for her wish list of field research projects in Latin America that she would do if she had funding, abundant funding. In an instant, Liz confessed that she had always wanted to study the Cuban Revolution, certainly since she had visited the country in 1972. Since then, Liz had read with great interest about the travails of Oscar Lewis, known for his studies on the culture of poverty, an anthropologist who had gone to Cuba to carry out oral history research during the late 1960s. But then Lewis ran up against the Cuban regime in 1970, a year of tremendous dislocation and disappointment after the failure of the 10 million ton sugar harvest, when Castro suddenly had a change of heart and shut Lewis's oral history project down and expelled Lewis and his wife from the country. Later, no less a luminary and friend of Fidel, it might be added, than Gabriel Garcia Marquez initiated a similar project, only to abandon it in midstream. There is still much to learn about these abortive oral history projects, their subjects, and the Cuban regime. But for Liz, here suddenly in the year 2000 was an extraordinary chance to, as she would put it, banish the ghost of Oscar Lewis and turn her dream into a tangible research project, supported by generous funding from the Ford Foundation and later a Swedish NGO. For the funding world, Liz Dore, with her superlative academic credentials, her leftist political sympathies, her logistical advantage of living in England while also being an American citizen, turned out to be the ideal scholar activist to carry out this research project at long last. The rest is history, and the end product is the book you have in your hands, or hopefully soon will. Beginning in 2000, Liz spent 5 years mounting the research team. Originally, it was composed of 10 Cuban social scientists, most of whom had connections to the government, as well as 3 British research collaborators. In those days, foundation money flowed, her researchers were fired up, the team's methodology was being worked out, many potential narrators were being recruited, and pilot interviews were conducted. The only problem, the Cuban government was reluctant to grant its final approval to the project. In fact, it took 5 years of go-aheads and setbacks to finally win government permission. In the end, it was Liz's insistent appeal to Mariela Castro, the daughter of Raul and passionate advocate of the LGBTQ rights movement, that finally swayed the top authorities and sealed the deal in 2005. By then, however, the original Cuban research team had dissolved, so Liz had to improvise by expanding the pool and seeking out a younger group of researchers, most of whom were less tied to official government authority, more willing to ask probing questions, and eager to recruit subjects through informal channels. The results quickly deepened the pool and widened the diversity of research collaborators and the people they recruited for interviews. And so the scale and longevity of this oral history project exploded. In all, the project recorded the voices of 124 people between 2005 and 2008. They hailed from different parts of Cuba and represented a wide spectrum of lived experiences, socio-racial and gender identities, class statuses, ideological perspectives, life stories, and moral memories. From this oral testimony flowed an amazing array of candid, often heart-wrenching stories, opinions, sentiments, and remembrances. Many narrators literally grew up during this 12-year period of research. Friendships were forged. Many narrators grew more trusting. Testimony often became bolder and more spontaneous, and you can actually see this a little bit in the book as she goes on through time. Real names were never used, however. Out of that enormous pool of oral testimony, the life stories of 7 men and women are featured in the book. Were Liz with us today, we might ask her 2 obvious methodological questions. First, why did the book foreground so few narrators when the pool of interviewees was so ample? And second, what were the criteria for deciding whose life stories to feature? One final note. Back in 2000, the initial goal of the Cuban Voices project was to understand the ways that social memory changed over the course of the revolution's 70+ years, an impossibly ambitious aim. invoking Ian Van Siena's axiom that, quote, oral tradition is past and present in a single breath, unquote. Dore's project set out to record the life stories of Cubans of all ages to see how people's everyday memories and lived experiences of the revolution have been shaped by the tumultuous changes in contemporary times. In this book, Liz chose to highlight the interviews of younger people, those born in the late 1970s and 80s. They had come of age during the relatively prosperous 1980s. So they experienced the trauma of post-Soviet crisis, Cuba's special period. And more recently, they have felt the shock effects of austerity as Raul Castro promoted economic privatization, fired thousands of state workers, and as class and racial inequality have deepened in Cuba, setting off new waves of emigration. Quote, almost everyone we interviewed of the post-Soviet generation talked about their depression and disillusion, Liz writes. They felt their future had been taken away, yet people reacted differently depending on their circumstances and their attitude, unquote. By interviewing a diverse group of people, from a techie and a CP member who works for the Ministry of Industry, to a hustler in the black market, from a wealthy businessman who fled to Miami, to a humble Black woman beholden to the state for her job as a night watchman or watchwoman, this oral history project defies easy characterization of the Cuban experiences, memories, or sensibilities. Yet Liz's research team discovered that in spite of the political and ideological divide that cleaves Cuban society, quote, the majority of the people they interviewed expressed similar hopes and grievances, unquote. The Cuban Voices project portrays with searing honesty the bitterness, hope, flashes of humor, how this generation of Cubans have survived and sometimes even thrived as the promises of the revolution were falling apart. That this extraordinary project of oral history flourished and was finally published in both England and the United States, albeit after Verso shamefully reneged on its contract and turned the manuscript down, is no small miracle. It's tangible testimony to Liz Dore's character and her research skills, her candor, her empathy, her clear-eyed analysis, her humor, and her egalitarian ethos, her fierce commitment to the cause of social justice, and her perseverance in the face of serious health issues. But perhaps the greatest gift that Liz Dore and her colleagues have bequeathed to posterity is the massive archive of Cuban voices recorded over 15 years. Those recordings are now safely deposited in Columbia's Oral History Archive, thanks to the efforts of Rachel and Matt Weeks Dore and to the work of Flor Barceló. Someday, I hope this oral history collective will be replicated and returned to Cuba, where it truly belongs.
Very good. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. All right. We're working together here. All right. Hitting them and they are joining us. Okay. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3. You guys can hear me? All right. Great. Great. Well, let me say a couple preliminary words and then I'll dive into my prepared remarks. First of all, I want to say how great it is to be here among new and old friends. This is a fabulous room. I'm literally looking up at the Empire State Building. This is why it's called the Skylight Room. It's still daylight, so I can see the skylight. But even better is looking out and seeing all of you, some of my students, some of my colleagues, some new friends, some old friends. dissertation advisor, lots of people here. It's good to be back together in the flesh. Secondly, I have placed here a flyer. It is from Duke University Press. They are giving us, anyone who buys the book through that flyer using the code that's on that flyer gets $10 off, 30 bucks goes down to 20 bucks. And so I have some flyers that you can take, but don't take that one. That one is for you to take a picture so that you can get the little code, and then you can go online and buy the book, okay? So maybe you can just put these on that chair over there. You guys can take these, right? Or maybe put them in the very back on that counter. That would be great. And that way, those of you who want to buy the book can do that. Let me specifically recognize my students. Raise your hand if you're one of my students. Okay, there's just 2 of you. Okay, could you guys stand up, please? I won't make you talk, I promise. Okay, I teach a class. Oh, 3 of you. There are, okay, you were hiding over there. Okay, there are 3, perfect. You know why? Because I have 3 books. So come up and get your book. All right, we're using this book this semester in my Cuban culture and society class. And because they showed up, they don't have to buy the book. All right, so smart students. Okay, good. The ones who are on Zoom are very angry right now, right? But this is the benefit for showing up in the flesh. So thanks for coming. All right. I want to thank the Bildner Center for hosting us, Desmond, and also Rosalina, who's not here, but the fact that anything works is due to her good hard work preparing things. I also want to recognize a few people who couldn't be here because they're either in Cuba or they're in other places around the world, but they probably are listening in via Zoom. One especially is Olga Saavedra, who was a photographer, or is a photographer, and was part of the team that worked on this project. And she also was a very good friend of Liz's in London. She lives in London. She's a Cuban photographer and academic who lives in London, and hopefully she's joining us via Zoom. Also, we're recording this so we can share it. I was particularly hoping we could broadcast this on Zoom and record it because we're talking about Cuba, but we're in New York. Now, we're doing it in English, right, which can't be helped, but quisiera dar la bienvenida a los amigos hispanohablantes y especialmente los que están en Cuba, so that because we're talking about Cuban lives, I want to make sure that this circulates to the greatest extent among Cubans, whether they're in Cuba or not, right? And then finally, the title. The title, I thought about what should we call this, and I came down on Hearing Cuban Voices in a Time of Crisis. And partly that was inspired by Liz Dore herself and her tricky, provocative title of her book, right? So Hearing Cuban Voices. We want to hear Cuban voices, but we actually really want to listen to the Cuban voices, right? Actively listen, right? Also, the problem with the title, or the tricky part of the title, is a time of crisis. Liz Dore's book and the project really looks at the last 40 years, right? When you hear a time of crisis, you think of Cuba's current crisis, but Cuba has struggled, and the Cuban people have struggled over years, decades of different crises. So when we talk about a time of crisis, unfortunately, we have to ask which one. I'm going to have to mute that person. We'll see. And Liz, of course, I think she labored over her own title for her book because I found various traces on the internet of the book announced with different titles over the years, right? And she changed the titles, and the final title that she landed on is quite interesting, provocative, and tricky. It's tricky because it's not called Things Fall Apart, which we all know, Chinua Achebe, right? The famous book about British colonialism in Nigeria, but How Things Fall Apart. But there's certainly the trace of that there. And then, what happened to the Cuban Revolution? Is that a question? What happened to the Cuban Revolution? What happened? Or is it a statement? this book is going to tell you what happened to the Cuban Revolution, or these people in the book are going to tell you what happened to the Cuban Revolution, okay? And then finally, to start my actually prepared remarks, I'm going to quote a communist. I know my crowd, both on Zoom and in the audience, are either communist, ex-communist, or anti-communist, right? If you hold a thing about Cuba, you're going to get all three of those, right? You're not going to get anyone who's indifferent to communism, right? Communist, an ex-communist, or an anti-communist, right? I grew up Catholic, so I can relate to being an ex-something, right? I'm going to quote a communist, an Italian communist, Antonio Gramsci. Seek the truth and tell it, because only the truth is revolutionary. He was also a journalist, so that's very appropriate. But I think also if you're a social scientist trying to find the truth, it's very elusive, but that's what you're supposed to be seeking. And I think this book is a fabulous example of that. So Elizabeth Dore managed to secure official approval and sponsorship through the good offices, as we've heard from Brooke, of Cenesex director Mariela Castro Espín, whom Dore learned had a, quote, reputation for fighting for lost causes, unquote. Who told her that? Well, our good friend Julio Cesar González Pajes, who was also a member of the project team. There was even a formal launching ceremony in March of 2005 in the Aula Magna, what a great name for a place. That's even better than the Skylight Room, Aula Magna, right? Of the University of Havana. And who spoke at that event? Actually, Elizabeth Dore didn't speak, or if she did, it wasn't recorded. The three people who were recorded, and maybe this is someone who's a director is good at being invisible and letting other people talk, right? Mariela Castro Espín spoke. Fernando Ortiz, Foundation Director Miguel Barnett spoke, and Paul Thompson, who's known as the father of oral history, spoke. So, doing research in Cuba, and then you have ... no es fácil. It ain't easy. So this is one of the things that Elizabeth Dore experienced. I'm sure that she wasn't surprised, but I bet she learned a lot about the trials and tribulations of this, okay? First, the project was temporarily suspended in 2007 by the Cuban government after they had waited 5 years to have it started between 2000 and 2005. This was because certain delinquents and antisocial elements, entre comillas, right, had been included in the research and allowed to tell their stories. As a result, half of the original research team dropped out, most of whom were Communist Party members, which is a detail on their CVs that Dore actually became aware of later. 6 months later, the project was allowed to continue, but now on a, quote, less formal and less frequent basis. A lot of things get done in Cuba on an informal basis, most things I would imagine, right? But she tried to go in through the front door. She got through the front door, but she ended up doing a lot maybe out the side door or the back door, right? To Dore's credit, she took advantage of this shuffle, as she calls it in the book's fascinating chapter called just Backstory, which is at the beginning. And she and her team expanded the pool of interviewers to include interviewers who were, quote, younger and less politically attached researchers. The second hiccup or obstacle was that after the completion of the interviews in 2018, nearly all the remaining Cuban project team members asked Dore to remove their names from the published book itself. This was after they learned of its critical content. Imagine the irony of a book of oral histories where the interviewers are more concerned about protecting their anonymity than are the interviewees. Even though, of course, it is the latter who actually share their life stories and sometimes their critical opinions. While Dore in the book never explicitly tells us the team members' reasons for requesting anonymity, it is likely because they disagreed with her analysis and conclusions about the Cuban Revolution having fallen apart, or because they feared the repercussions of being associated with a dire depiction of the revolution, or both disagreeing and fearing. Finally, Dore experienced, and we heard a little bit about this again from Brooke, great difficulty at the end of her life, not just finishing the book, but finding a publisher. The book was controversial, and the left-wing Verso Press, which had agreed to publish it, balked. No doubt Verso had expected to publish a different, more upbeat book based on Cubans' memories of the revolution, not the chronicle of a death foretold that Dore handed in as a manuscript, right? Not Gabo's book, but her manuscript. But a lot changed in Cuba in the 15 years between 2005 and 2020, and most of that change was not for the better. Perhaps Verso's change of heart stemmed from, in part, from Dore's abandonment, as I mentioned before, of her more neutral original working titles. One was Cuban Lives, What Difference Did a Revolution Make? Question mark. Another was Cuba is Not What You Think. And then, of course, she changed the title, or the final title is what we have there, right? How Things Fall Apart, What Happened to the Cuban Revolution. Thankfully, Dore's book did eventually find a home in the UK and was published there in August of 2022 by the Apollo imprint Head of Zeus, before being republished a year later in August 2023 in the US by Duke. Brooke talked about Oscar Lewis. And so I have a whole section that I don't have to talk about Oscar Lewis, but the Oscar Lewis story is very interesting and, of course, very relevant because it was funded by the Ford Foundation. It involved the direct verbal approval of a member of the Castro family, and it was oral histories, right? And it ran into its fair share of bumps along the way, and actually ended up being closed down. And Lewis and his partner in crime, his wife, Ruth Maslow Lewis, were returned to the United States. And tragically, Oscar Lewis died in December of 1970 of a heart attack 6 months after leaving Cuba, and really spent the last 6 months of his life trying to frantically contact his contacts in Cuba, get a meeting with Fidel. If only Fidel knew what was going on, this wouldn't have happened, was kind of his default, at least at first. He also wanted to protect the people who worked on the project to make sure that they didn't get into trouble. And he wanted to recover more than 10,000 pages of materials, including transcripts and tapes that were confiscated by state security in Cuba. So, the ghost of Oscar Lewis kept me awake at night is the wry way Dore notes her keen awareness of the promise and the peril of her project, right? Number one, doing social science research at all, doing it on a sensitive topic, doing it in a communist country, and then, para el colmo, right? Doing it with foreign research, Ford Foundation research money, right? Funding, okay? Of course, Dore, if it wasn't an ace in the hole, she had some things on her side. Her well-known lifelong progressive bona fides and the fact that she lived and worked outside the United States undoubtedly allowed her to win initial trust and goodwill in official circles on the island, okay? Still, her reference in the opening of the book to the Lewis affair, and this is as notorious if you are a foreign researcher as the Padilla affair is if you're a native Cuban intellectual. It indicates that she was never naive about the risks involved in the project she was undertaking. Now I'm going to talk about two of the methodological research strategies that she used, and she explains these in her backstory section of the book. Improvisation and catharsis. When Dore initiated her project, okay, and as I said, it was also primarily sponsored by the Ford Foundation, she gained three surprising methodological insights beyond the actual things that she collected, which is the stories of the Cubans. First, the formal research plans she and her team had drawn up turned out to be impractical, so they improvised. Quote, interviewing pretty much wherever and whoever we could, end quote. This make-do strategy, which Dore initially thought was a weakness, turned out to be a strength since it allowed the team to learn from their mistakes, adjust, and probably most importantly, greatly expand their pool of interviewees to include many respondents located through informal networks. And if you know Cuba, informal networks are hugely important. And these complemented the contacts and the interviewees found through official channels. This strategy was key in turning the book, turning it alive, at least in my opinion, because you can kind of tell, and maybe read between the lines, which of these were maybe officially found and which of these were informally found, and it creates a good, rich kind of balance. In my opinion, at least, three of the most interesting and critical-minded interviewees, Alina, a censored filmmaker, Esteban, a supposed delinquent, and Pavel, a well-known dissident, would certainly never have been included had the team relied exclusively on official channels. So turning a problem into a solution was a really brilliant thing. And I have actually, over the past 6 or 8 months, as we've been kind of reading the book, I've reached out and I've actually
Santa!
2 of the people who are featured in the book. One person in the book of the 7 is actually identified by her real name because she's a fairly well-known filmmaker. She doesn't live in Cuba anymore, but she made a film that it created a sensation. Buscándote Havana is what it's called, right? And basically it's a film about people living illegally in Havana, coming from the countryside and kind of squatting in Havana, and then all the troubles that they have getting services, getting kind of legalized in Havana. And of course it was controversial, right? But it actually won awards at the same time as being censored. Very Cuban, right? And another is identified as Pavel in the book, and he's actually a friend of mine. He's a fairly well-known dissident and independent journalist. And so I've been contacting them, and we're almost definitely going to have the filmmaker, Alina Rodriguez Abreu, who will be here maybe in November for our second panel, and maybe Pavel, and I'll reveal who Pavel actually is later, but he's actually the person in the book, if you read it, who begs Elizabeth Dore, who he always refers to as Liz, right? Because he developed a good friendship with her because Liz was a good friend of his mother, and that's how she found him, right? He was begging her, hey, I'm happy, even proud, use my name. But for legal and also anonymity reasons to protect her sources, she changed everyone's name except for Alina, right? Second, while it is commonly assumed that Cuban society is highly polarized into supportive and oppositional bandos or camps, the actual interviews revealed that this assumption exaggerates the divide and ignores the common hardships, hopes, and grievances most Cubans share. Finally, the team was surprised to discover that many people were in fact willing to tell their stories, quote, pretty much the way they remembered them, unquote. Yes, they found ample evidence of the famous evil Cuban twins, self-censorship, and la doble moral. But as the interviews deepened, the power of catharsis tended to win out. Quote, I never said this to anyone before, but it feels so good to say it, unquote, was a common reaction among the project's interviewees. Importantly, I'll call her Liz now instead of Dore, right? That's much more appropriate, I think, in this environment, right? Liz was also clear with her interviewees about 2 additional things. She promised them that their identities would be disguised, but she reminded them, as if they needed to be reminded, that, quote, in Cuba, anonymity only goes so far. Neighbors might inform, state officials might discover who you are. Now I'm going to end my comments by saying a few things about the book itself, and then I will pass the baton to Flor. And I want to do this by basically saying that there are 3 books in one here, right? The first book is, you could say, Dore's editorial argument about what happened to the Cuban Revolution. The second book is kind of the making of, right? The information that she shares with us about the project and how this book, what it rests on, right? The foundation it rests on and the various struggles and solutions they had to, the inventos, right? If you're Cuban, you know invento, right? They had to do in order to make this work. And then finally, there is the pollo del arroz con pollo, right? There is the main dish. There is the main thing, which are the 7 interviewees who are highlighted. Now, before there was a question, which is a very good one, why 7 out of 124? Or why these 7 out of 124? But you could also ask, why 124 out of 10 million? Right? So you've always got to make a choice, a decision. And Liz was working against the clock to finish the book. And I think that she was really trying to, choose people who were representative of a broad array within a generation that experienced the 40 years. So, book 1 is Dore's take on modern Cuba. That is, in these sections of the book, she frames the much longer and more detailed narrative sections that feature her 7 interviewees with her own argument and analysis. And how would I summarize her argument and analysis? In order to survive, the government chose to make pro-market economic changes that successfully save the regime, but at the price of abandoning socialism and the revolution. That's not my analysis, but that's my take on what her argument is in the book. And to quote her, the changes temporarily propped up the economy, but ruined the country. Save the economy, ruin the country. For her, as a lifelong socialist and activist and scholar, what does ruin the country mean? It had mostly to do with the precipitous rise in Cuba of inequality. It also had to do with the return of racial discrimination. And finally, there's un malo en esta película. There's a bad guy, there's a villain. And ironically, the villain is the father of her ally, Mariela, and this is Raul, right? The book kind of plays with a Fidel-Raul dynamic, and Raul always comes out on the losing end, especially regarding his economic policies, right? The Raulista understanding of egalitarianism, for example, it's not a strength, it's not an achievement of the revolution, and it should not be celebrated or defended, but it's a weakness. We have to mock it and abandon it, egalitarianism. Dore argues, or Liz argues in the prologue, that Raul's economic changes, and this was really brilliantly done, because there's a lot of ways that are very wordy to say this, but she said it in a very pithy, direct way. Many of Raul Castro's economic changes gave some Cubans more economic freedoms than at any time since 1959. And then Americans will go, clap, right? Most Americans, some Americans, right? And then she says, other Cubans, however, encountered a different kind of freedom. They were free to be poor and hungry. Ouch, right? Book 2 I've already talked about, which is the backstory, and Brooke talked a bit about that. So I will end by just giving you a taste of book 3 so that you buy your own copy and read it, okay? Book 3 is comprised of the self-told stories or self-told tales of the book's 7 narrators. Who are they? We have Mario, a young Black and iconoclastic party cadre. Alina, a censored but prize-winning filmmaker. Juan, an Afro-Cuban high school dropout and jack of all trades, who at the same time nurses a lifelong wound of racial discrimination, even if he can't always name the racial discrimination as such. Esteban, un antisocial, un delincuente in the Cuban slang. This is the label that he was given. And Esteban is the person included in the book whose presence had the project suspended. He's also a would-be immigrant, but that doesn't really distinguish him much anymore since this is a very common reality, all too common. Barbara is an impoverished Black loyalist, aspirant to Communist Party membership, who fights Cuba's and her own husband's machismo largely by herself. Pavel, an eloquent, if embattled, dissident and independent journalist, and Alejandro, a star student and well-off professional who can't wait to move to Miami because he expects there he will, quote, live better. Liz caught up with him in Miami, caught up with Alejandro in Miami, and it was quite a struggle, right? He discovered that getting out of Cuba is one battle, surviving in Miami is a whole other battle, right? And so they are the pollo of the Arroz con Pollo. I invite you to read the book and get to know them. Thank you very much.
Hola, hello. Hope everyone is okay. So if okay, I think it's working. Yeah, okay, great. So thank you, first of all, Ted, for inviting me, for having me here. Thanks to CUNY as well for hosting the event. I'm so glad to be here. I mean, it took me a lot of work to process this collection, so I wanted to get to know it a little bit. And maybe visit it at some point. Okay, so when I was chosen as an intern at Columbia University Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, I was told that I would work with a Cuban oral history archive made up of more than 100 testimonies. At the time, I was not yet familiar with Elizabeth Dore's work, but I was quickly intrigued by the volume of the collection and the temporal extension of it. The first stories date back to 2004 or 2005, as Brooke told us, while some of them extend to 2018. More than 14 years of dedication to a complex project, which was at risk of being completed several times. There was no way I couldn't be intrigued. My first job was to read How Things Fall Apart, What Happened to the Cuban Revolution. I wanted to understand what had led Dore to take an interest in Cuba and try to understand as well why she had dedicated so many years to this research. I think that what mobilized Dore was nothing more than an interest in failure in a positive sense. That is, as a power, and was what we must learn from it in order to improve our futures. In her words, and I quote her, "Socialism in Cuba is over, at least for the time being. At this point in its history, a measure of social democracy would be good for the country, but it is hard to imagine how the government and its people would get there. The memories of the post-Soviet generation might serve as a beginning," unquote. The memories that Dore collected then could light the way to new possibilities of government in Cuba, to a new political dawn. At first, my job was to familiarize myself with the role of the archivist. As Kate Ahorn argues in Turner Archival, I felt that even after dedicating much of my day to working with archives, my understanding of what my colleagues who work as archivists and what professional librarians do for a living remained partial at best. In that sense, I think that my task in this panel has to do with approaching the materials that make up the Cuban Voices collection to a broader public. When we were summoned by TED to be part of this talk, my colleagues from the library insisted that I be the one to present the collection, even though I'm not a librarian. Despite being an intern, I think I am still the only person besides those who participated as interviewers to know in depth all the stories of Cuban Voices, since I had to listen to them, read them, organize them, catalog them. After listening to and reading all the interviews, I had to elaborate the biography of each of the participants along with a short description of the content of what was being discussed. This work took me 3 months, and I think that is also why I feel a kind of urgency for others to know about it. I will tell you then what it's about. The interviews in the Cuban Voices, our history collection, aim to engage in conversations with Cubans who have lived through the transition to communist rule after the Cuban Revolution, or who have experienced the events that followed that historical process. The objective of the project, headed by Dore, was not related to interviewing people who had established themselves as public or political figures after the revolution, but rather to generate a dialogue with ordinary citizens whose narratives do not appear in what we can call official history. Most of the interviewees then are not prominent personalities. The interviewees are professionals, campesinos, teachers, sex workers, state officials, cooks, maintenance personnel, people who work clandestinely, among other functions. This is the first element that, in my opinion, is remarkable from the collection. The collection was not produced in order to tell the lives of the revolutionaries who were protagonists, but rather to think about the Cuban Revolution from the perspective of the people who participated, or who are the children of those who participated, but who didn't stand out. In many of the accounts, Fidel Castro or Vilma Espín appear as a character of a story in a list of names of people who participated in a particular event. This allows us to access narratives that are, so to speak, more domestic, more quotidian, and less heroic. Many of these interviews were not incorporated into the book, as you mentioned before. I don't think this accounts for an erasure, but for a spatial economy. It would be impossible to compress all the interviews into one investigation or one research. Perhaps to the selection that Dore has made for How Things Fall Apart accounts for a selection that is not random, but rather seeks to serve her narrative of the events that emerge from the interviews. However, the fact that the interviews are now available for consultation allows us to access archival materials that are, above all, contradictory. A unified account of what is happening or had happened in Cuba cannot be put together based on these testimonies. On the contrary, hatred of Fidel Castro coexists with devotion. The denial of racism coexists with criticisms of the exclusion of Black communities and specifically of Afro-Cuban religions. The exaltation of the Cuban campesino is mixed with stories about those who felt they should go into exile. In the Cuban Voices collection, there is no unified history. There is no single way of thinking about the Cuban Revolution. It is this coexistence that makes the archives so interesting and what allows us to think of another series of possible ways of telling what happened in Cuba that will not necessarily coincide with Dore, for example. The storytellers usually discuss their family history and the effects of the Cuban Revolution had on their lives. In this sense, different topics related to daily life in Cuba emerge, such as the problems linked to the lack of employment, housing, and economic resources to survive. At the same time, the narrators discuss issues related to diversity in the archipelago, such as racism, homosexuality, gender violence, the inclusion of women in the labor market, and machismo. Since the interviews have been conducted with the endorsement of the National Center for Sex Education, CNSX, as we know it in Spanish, the interviews focus on asking questions about sexual diversity and racism, specifically around the changes that Black, gay, and lesbian people experienced with the arrival of the revolution. Some storytellers are part of these communities, so these experiences are enriching for direct access to information on topics related to diversity. I remember that here we find translation problems when making content summaries. Although I do not consider myself a specialist in Cuba, I have worked with Latin American social movements, especially with the histories of sex dissident organizations on the continent. In this sense, there are expressions or even words that are historically inserted in a different way in Latin America than in the United States. How can we refer, for example, to a campesino without using that word, which has a specific weight in the framework of Latin American social struggles? The same happened with words like homosexual. Perceiving oneself with that nomenclature in Latin America brings with it a dispute, since this is how a large part of the LGBT plus social organizations were defined during the 70s and the 80s. Each word that appeared in these archives has an obviously political content in Spanish that perhaps does not exist in English. This is one of the reasons why we decided that the collection would be available in both Spanish and English. At the same time, I was particularly interested in the fact that Spanish-speaking people could access these materials, mostly because the interviews were conducted in Spanish, but also I have the feeling that maybe I'm mistaken, but that people who asked to hear or read the transcripts of the collection might expect it to be in English if we only describe it in English. On the other hand, I was, and still am, eager for Spanish-speaking people to approach the materials in order to be able to put together many other stories from it. I also remember that the discussion around what names to use in the file was important. As Brooke and Ted discussed before, not only do we have the real names of the people interviewed, because I had access to all the Excels that Elizabeth did, which were amazing, very productive, but also their fiction's name. Since Elizabeth chose to use the fiction's names in How Things Fall Apart, we thought it best to continue down that path. As far as we knew, these fiction's names served to protect people from a possible political attack on their persons. First of all, we thought it was better to protect them, which is why when I cite any of the interviews, I will use the names that leave the interviews anonymous, as Ted did. On the other hand, the interviews focus on economic survival related to the special period of Periodo Especial. The narrators comment on their difficulties in accessing economic resources. Some of them narrate their experiences around clandestine work and leads with tourists in order to obtain money, as Ted mentioned before. Discussions around sex work, the illegal circulation of dollars, the rights of Cubans as opposed to those of foreign visitors, and exile come into play in these interviews. Regarding this last point, the narrators are interrogated about specific episodes, such as the Mariel Exodus or the Éxodo de Mariel, the migration on rafts during the 1990s, and the disputes around the custody of Elian Gonzalez, a topic that gave much to talk about the time several of the interviews were conducted. Although all the interviews were dedicated to answering the questions that the team asked them, I think that my favorite stories, the one I enjoyed listening to the most, were those that had interlocutors who liked to talk about other topics, even the places they were while the interview was taking place. I remember in particular the interview with Javier, who owns a farm in Cuba. And I remember him because he shares a name with my father's name, so I have him in my mind. For more than an hour, Javier describes his farm, his work as a farmer, all the crops he has, and why a certain type of irrigation is better, among other details of campesino life. You can tell that the interviewers are a little tired of the level of specificity of the issue, but they dedicate themselves to listening to Javier very calmly. During the interview with Javier, a series of sounds typical of the countryside can be heard in the background. There is a sound dimension in the stories that I also found remarkable. One can listen to Cuba as a backdrop for the interviews and get an account of the schedules of Cuban life. I think there is another possible use for the collection there that has to do with the sound of it all. I don't know if I'm right, but maybe someone is interested in that. The storytellers also discussed the education they received, especially about access to free studies. Regarding their studies, they also discussed the barriers to access to education faced by Black people and women. Following the same tone, the narrators dialogue about the public health system and the lack of medical resource. Some narrators talk about experiences linked to being in state prisons, either as workers or as people impacted by the justice system. In this sense, other issues emerge such as state violence, censorship, political persecution, and the control of the population that is considered dangerous, as Ted mentioned before, for or by the Cuban government. Concerning the latter, I have very much in mind the stories of Lázaro and Rosa. Both define themselves as homosexual, although in opposite position with respect to the treatment experienced due to their identity. Rosa, for her part, discusses the link between the Federación de Mujeres Cubanas and LGBT+ organizations and the contributions that Mariela Castro and CNSX have made in terms of accessibility to human rights. Lázaro, on the other hand, Lázaro, on the other hand, recounts scenes of the repression of homosexuals and travestis in the region that oppose what Rosa narrates. The same happens with some people who practice Afro-Cuban religions. There are those who consider that they have been persecuted and those who think that religions coexist freely in the archipelago. These are some examples of the contradictions I was talking about earlier, which allow us to elaborate on the similar stories from the same archive. I'm not saying that this is problematic, but rather the opposite. The power of our history lies in the multiplicity of voices, which we can well find in this collection. Around everyday life, many storytellers dialogue about the different jobs that they had, both within the employment allocation system regulated by the state and what is known as clandestine employment. These illegal jobs consist mostly of the purchase and sale of real estate or appliances and marketing based on foreign currency. Again, this is just the archives. I mean, obviously we can talk about and discuss a lot of forms of clandestine working in Cuba, but this is what emerges in the archives. At the same time, some narrators describe job insecurity. The interviews also show a strong political commitment to the process initiated by the Cuban Revolution. Many narrators comment on the structural changes they experienced after 1959, the redistribution of wealth and social assistance for the most vulnerable sectors of the population. This is something that doesn't appear in Liz's book, for example. Other narrators discuss the possibility of accessing university studies. The interviews comment on the literacy process that was experienced in the archipelago. Likewise, the interviews discuss the changes in the life of the campesinos since the agrarian reform and the founding of agricultural work cooperatives. The storytellers also recall their experiences in the Partido Comunista, de Unión de Jóvenes Comunistas, the Comités de Defensa de la Revolución, o CDR, and the Federation, la Federación de Mujeres Cubanas. At the same time, some of them remember their participation in the wars that took place in Angola and Ethiopia, or in training spaces created by East Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Perhaps I have been a bit tedious in my presentation of all the topics that can be found in the archive, but I would like you to leave this conversation with a clear idea about what you can find in the collection. I think that the richness of these materials lies in, as I already mentioned, the breadth of voices, the voces cubanas, the Cuban voices, but also in the numbers of stories it contains. All can be accessed through transcripts or audio recordings, which are available upon request at Columbia's Rare Books and Manuscripts Library. To conclude my presentation, I would like to thank Rachel Dore, who was in charge of the materials and decided to donate them to Columbia because of her mother's connection to the university. I think we have honored this research by processing it and giving it a place to stay so it can be accessible to others and that other narratives can be written out of the hard work of Elizabeth Dore and her team. Thank you.
Now we're going to hear from our comentarista, discussant, Maria Cabrera Arus. And just let me say two things before she comes up here. First is our flyer and your purchase of the book, right? I have written in big letters E23 DORE, right? DORE. Huh? That's the code. It's on the bottom, but I wrote it in big letters. The flyers are in the back, but you can just write that down and you won't need the flyer. E23 DORE. All right. The second thing I wanted to say to introduce a bit or to explain Maria's presence here is that we at the Bildner Center spent a lot of time thinking about, arguing about, debating how this presentation would be, who the speakers would be, and we thought we got it all right. And then I said to myself, Dios mío, estamos hablando de voces cubanas sin una cubana o un cubano, right? There's no Cubans on the panel, right? And I said, I know just the person. And so she's brilliant. She's not here because she's Cuban, but she just happens to be Cuban and brilliant. So Maria.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Mom, for making me Cuban and getting me into this panel. I thank you, the three presenters, for the wonderful presentation, the diversity and the different topics that you each cover in your presentations. And I want to thank also Elizabeth Dore's family and posthumously Dore's as well for the generosity of donating the archive and making it available for public consultation, for study, as not only as a Cuban voice, but as a Cuban scholar, as a person who has been studying Cuban society for decades now. I cannot tell you how hard it is for everybody who studying Cuba, and Ted himself is very aware of this, to get access to historical data, to historical information on Cuba, because of the archive in Cuba are closed for, and you see, and when you read the book, I didn't read the book, the whole book, but I read some chapters. I didn't have access to the book before today, and I apologize for that, but you're gonna read how difficult it was, even for a person who was a member of the Communist Party at some point and who was a socialist in the United States and a sympathizer with the Cuban government, to get a permit to go to Cuba and do research on Cuba. So imagine for the Cuban voices who live outside of Cuba, that's impossible to get access to the archive in Cuba, to conduct oral history on Cuba. So the fact that this corpus of research is available, is already online, and I thank you, all the personnel also at Columbia University who work so hard, and I know how hard it is to to do that. I had to create my own archive when I was doing my research in order to circumvent the difficulties to conduct research in Cuba. So I just I want you to make sure and to how wonderful it is to have this oral history project in Columbia University and online as well. And the fact that it is, as you mentioned, ordinary voices, not, and the interviews were not conducted in a state framework. They were not mediated by people who were representative of the Cuban government, is also an extra value that this research has. I have many things to say. I'm not a presenter, so I'm going to be very, very brief. I had questions for you that I might not ask you because I think we're running a little bit short of time. But I just want to say also that, and this is something that I would have liked the book to have, and maybe it is in the book and I didn't find it because I didn't read the whole book. But when I was reading the pages I was given of the book, I wish to find more of a historical background and more of a incorporation of the academic literature on Cuba that already exists, and there are many books that are classics now, like Carmelo Mesa Lago on Cuban economic history, or Jorge Dominguez, Henken. Ted Henken also mentioned his own research. So there are so many, Lilian Guerra on history. There are so many books that cover the history of the Cuban Revolution before the special period that I think it would have been very important to have it incorporated in the book in order to better understand the dynamics that are being discussed on the special period. And I brought some quotes that I don't want to read here because I'm going to take too much time, but I sometimes felt that there were some misinterpretations or some incomplete interpretations of the historical processes that were that Elizabeth Dore were describing because of the lack of engaging with the scholarship on Cuba that has already been produced. So I don't want to get into too many details, but I just want to make that caveat and make it express it for you to when you read the book to be aware of that. We can talk about this in the Q&A questions. And I would also like to have, you said that there were 3 books in the book, so maybe the second book that you mentioned and that I didn't read was in there, but I would also like to know more about Dore's methodology when she was selecting her interviews, who were the person who conducted the interviews, who were they, whom or where did they work, how they were trained before being recruited by Dore, but also during the research that Dore was conducting, what political and institutional affiliations that they had. And I would have also liked to see more diversity within the book because all of the interviews, the 7 persons that are included in the book, they all came of age in the 1990s, except for one. So all the recollections they have of the 1980s or before are probably not memories that they acquired through they are not very conscious about those recollections. There are something that maybe they learn in school and not, especially when they talk about problems and social issues and difficulties that Cubans face in the 80s. So probably I would have liked to see more of a diversity in terms of age in the subjects that were included in the book. I think I'm gonna skip all this and yeah, and because of that lack of, and this is the last thing I'm gonna mention, that lack of probably engagement with the academic literature, I would have liked to see less of a radical break between the special period and the 80s, and more like of a continuity between the history of Cuba in the 1980s and in the 1990s. There are many dynamics that they might look as appearing anew in the 1990s, but if you have some history of the Cuban, some knowledge of the Cuban history or have conducted or written on Cuba, you know that they had, they were not new, that they were developed and emerged in the, not even in the 80s, probably in the 1970s or even in the 1960s. At some point, Dore mentioned that material incentives were introduced in the early 80s as a response to the Mariel boat leave, and this is something that's not the case. They were introduced in the mid-60s, late 60s, and especially in the 1970s. So yeah, I would, because of the lack of engagement with that previous literature, that might have led Dore to incur in some ambiguities in terms of her analysis. But that doesn't take any merit at all of the huge research she conducted, of the value of the archive that's available at Columbia University. And I just wish for more research on the collection, and especially I want to hear more about women voices in the oral history, probably also dissident voices, not people who thought that the revolution fell apart in the 90s, but those who thought that it fell apart probably in the 70s or in the 60s that there were also Cubans who think so. So I'm gonna leave it like that. I have a question that I'm not gonna ask you, but I just want to ask Brooke one question. At what point did Elizabeth Dore begin to write the book? When did she feel that she had enough information in order to sit down and write? Was at the end of the research? What at some point in the middle of the research? Did she have any regret about the research when she was doing it? So there are two questions instead of one. So thank you.
Okay, our tradition at the Bildner Center is after the comentarista speaks, the panelists can respond. And so I would invite the panelists to respond, and then we'll hear from you. And you guys can put in the chat questions if you want, and I'll try to get to them. And what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions so that we can get them in and hear them, and then we'll try to respond to them. If you want to make a statement, that's fine. Just make it brief. If you have the question, that's even better. But you can do either. So, would you like to respond to her question first, and then we can?
A couple of other comments.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And let's see if we can stay here.
Yeah.
And use these little babies. We pay all the money for them, right? We might as well use them, right?
Okay,
Testing. Yeah, that's good.
that's
that
good. Is that working? Yeah, okay, great. Well, I'll start with the last question. It's not working. Yeah, okay, right? How about that? No, you have to eat it. You have to have it stuck in your throat.
Ice cream cone, right?
Yeah. Okay. I think maybe Rachel and Matt could probably answer this about the writing process, but we do know that Liz was writing all along, or at least in the second half of this research project, and she was publishing already a series of things and giving talks everywhere. So it was a process that was going on for quite a while, I think, even as the interviews were continuing. But then she really put shoulder to wheel, I guess, starting around, well, you could help me out here, but maybe around, 2015 or 2016, around then? I don't know. Am I right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's one thing. I want to talk just a couple of very brief things. She had in mind other volumes. She was going to write something on women, and she dreamed of writing something intergenerational that emphasized the older folk. But they were the ones whose memories have been mostly recorded. So she knew that, and her priority was to give voice to those people who had not yet been studied or listened to. So that's one thing. This was to be one of several volumes. Secondly, sociocultural context, absolutely. You're reading this, and many of us bring context to it because we know Cuban history. To teach this, you'd have to pair it with probably a good history or socioeconomic analysis of what's going on. If she had had time, and if Duke University had been generous, what she would have done is put a good bibliography, or at least a functional bibliography, into it so students could, get hold of what they needed to put all of this stuff in context. But she didn't have time. And so, you have to, when you teach this book, well, you're teaching it as part of a whole course on Cuba. But if you were to teach this book in isolation of the contextual history of the Cuban Revolution, it would be rough. You have to be able to pair it. So that's something, I think maybe a later edition, a later edition should be able to, do what couldn't be done. And anything else I wanted to say? I was struck by a theme that doesn't come up too often, that isn't discussed, but it may well be in the tapes. And that is the theme of the U.S.-Cuban relations, the blockade, Cuba's relationship to Latin America, the role of Venezuela, Mexico, et cetera. Cuban history and voices is really domestic. It's really internal. it has an interior sense to it. And yes, they talk about immigration and, right, the exoduses, et cetera, but that's about it. And, you know, for somebody like the older generation like us who grew up on, you know, U.S. imperialism and what we have done to destroy that experiment in socialism, it's just striking that this is not part of the conversation recorded here.
It is, in fact, I mean, you're 100% right. It is not part of what they were asking, for example. And I always thought about that because it's kind of like something I would like to listen to, the opinions they had on the US. There's a little bit about the relationships with Venezuela that appears in the interviews, but not so much about the relationship between Cuba and the US, besides the fact that some people went into exile and what happened to them, and maybe people discussing that their families were living in the US. But I think only 3 interviews have that question, and that would have been great. On the other hand, I wanted to say something more about what you said before on the bibliography. We do have on the archives, we do have a history context part of it, so like a description. So it's contextualized, and I think it works with the book as well.
I'm going to use of my prerogative as a Cuban voice, and I'm going to tell that perhaps for Cubans, he living in Cuba, and that's what I'm going to say doesn't mean that it's not important, the issue of the U.S.-Cuban relationships and the embargo, and I'm not meaning to underestimate the effect of the embargo on Cuba, but as a Cuban who grew up in Cuba, that's not a preoccupation for many Cubans at all. I mean, we were worried about other more immediate issues other than the effect of the embargo. Yeah, probably not much.
I'll only add that I think in some ways, and again, Liz is not here to respond to the questions, and she would be the one best to respond. But I would speculate that this was an issue that, you know, she probably knew, and it was so dominant coming from the United States and being an expatriate from the United States, partly because of U.S. foreign policy, right, that she wanted to go inside of Cuba and hear what the Cubans were talking about, because she already knew and maybe was convinced of this issue. But also, to kind of agree with Maria a bit, is that topic is one of the, you know, dominant oppressive topics that the Cuban government always reminds the people of. And for that reason, the people are sick of it, even if it's true and real, right? It's kind of like whenever I would bring up my first few trips to Cuba, I would bring up Che Guevara, and Cubans always rolled their eyes and were like, vomit, you know, because he ain't cool in Cuba, right? He's who you have to like salute when you go to school. That's not cool, right? But he can be cool outside of Cuba, right? You know, and so those are some things. I think, yes, I think the time issue was key. I think from the other articles that I've read and from other things that I've been kind of piecing together, it's clear that this book was supposed to be 5 men, the stories of 5 men, and then there was going to be a book of maybe 5 women, but time was of the essence and she needed to compress. And so the 5 men became 5 men and 2 women. You notice that there's only 2 women. It's not even, but I think that that's partly because of time. And then I think that she had to make the choice, okay, whose voice do I want to emphasize? Well, I'm going to emphasize the generation, and it's going to be a book about people who came of age in these 40 years. And I think that's why there's a marked kind of break, because it was like the 80s, and then the bottom falls out of society. I agree with you that there is more than enough material to argue about the falling apart in the 60s or in the 70s. But I think that generation, their bubble burst, 1990, 1989, 1991. I mean, and you know better than I, right? Because that's somewhat your generation, maybe a little bit of that, right? So I think that's probably what she was trying to do, is like, okay, what can I do that will make an impact with the material that I can finish? And I think that generational focus, and that's why there's 3 parts of the book: the 80s, 1990 to 2006, 2006 to the present, right? And because you have, the collapse of the Soviet Union, beginning of the special period, you have Fidel Castro getting ill, stepping down, and, and then you have, the end, right? Of the end of the book. Now, of course, what's happened in the last 4 years is also another major crisis, right? And hearing the voices of Cubans today is equally as important. So why don't we hear from you guys? And I will stand up here, and what I'm going to do is call on 3 of you, and then I'll repeat the question because you don't have a mic, or you can do the mic drop. Can you remove it from there? That's kind of hard. Here you go. Use this one.
Okay.
Testing. All right. So, but you hold the mic. Don't give it to anyone because they'll run away with it. I've been in Cuba conferences before. Okay. Hold the mic and just hold it next to them. Okay. So yeah, raise your hand and Maria will give you, stand next to you with the mic.
Thank you. I'm Rachel, Liz's daughter. This is Matt, Liz's son. So firstly, it's an honor and just a pleasure to hear it all. She obviously would have wanted to be here to hear it, but she'd be thrilled that that Ted, you and everyone is starting a long discussion, which she would hope would be a long discussion on what the interviews mean and what her book means. Just a few quick reflections in listening. One was that she wanted to make a book that was accessible to the public. That was her ambition from day one. She'd written, Brooke, I was chuckling as you were talking about the books she'd written before, like Peruvian mining, like kind of wonky books in some way, like very academic. So she'd written these super academic books, I think in a way to prove to herself that she could be the super academic, and then realize at some point she wants to talk to a broader audience. And I think this might relay to some of the points you rose, is that she was constantly challenging herself to write a book that everyone could read. And so she would read novels by Cuban authors and say, and would give them to me, would give them to Matt and say, could you read this? We'd read it. And she said, that's what I want to write. I want to write something that anyone will pick up, regardless if they're an academic, they just need to be curious about the topic. So just one reflection as you're talking about the book. Secondly, is that she started assuming the positive. She started, as she said to Verso, she said to Mariella, she started assuming she was going to be the champion that would tell a positive story of the Cuban Revolution. I think she knew she would find bits that they wouldn't necessarily love, but that overwhelming, this would be a success story of communism and socialism. And I think it took her a moment to really grapple with the reality of what she felt like she found, which will be contested in many different ways over time. And that's what she's excited about, I think, or was excited about. And I think it really took her a moment to reorient her thinking and challenge what had been, and Brooke can speak to it more, her longstanding commitment and views to communism and socialism and revolutions that happened during her lifetime. And so I think that was sort of a reckoning that she had personally as she was beginning to write it. And then the last, and Ted, you touched on it, is that she'd hoped to write many books. And that was a reason, we laughed at some point. When she gave me the first draft, Matt, I have to admit, I still haven't read it. I'm going to, it's not because I'm not interested, I'll get there. But she gave me the first draft and I looked in the cover, I was like, 5 men, I work on women's rights, and probably from her. And she said, no, but it's, gender is going to come in, but these men have to tell the story. And I think at some point she realized she couldn't tell the story of 5 men. She added these 2 women, as you say, but there were so many books she wanted to write. If you go onto her computer, you can still, she's written tons of a book on young people, just taking a separate bunch of stories from young people and starting to tell their story. She was definitely going to write a book about a bunch of women in it. So I think there was a lot that she was hoping to get out of it. And she definitely did not see this as the only book she would write, which is part of why we only have the 7.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful panel. I just wanted to make a couple of sort of disparate comments. I was doing research for my PhD in Havana in 2007, and I met Liz. I just wanted to, to just share for those of you guys who didn't have the opportunity to know her in this kind of context, in this kind of relationship, how supportive she was, how warm, how encouraging, how excited she was about other people's research. And for anybody who's done a PhD, which is probably a lot of people in this room, you will know how rare it is to meet a professor who is not on your committee, who takes an actual interest and remembers you and, continues to write to you. And I have many other colleagues who were of my generation who say the same thing about Liz. And she was just such a wonderful mentor and such an encouraging professor. And I also wanted to make a really kind of random comment as a historian, and I just wanted to add to, I think, some of the comments that Maria has already made about how important it is to have kind of a big sample of oral histories from this period, because it always amazes me that these types of oral histories have not been done either in Cuba. I know that Cuba has done many oral histories, but a lot of them are like, totally restricted. They're at the Consejo de Estado. They're done with leaders and not with ordinary people. So they have done many oral histories, or people kind of do them, sort of with, informally without a lot of support. And they've lost a huge opportunity to document, decades of that revolutionary transformation. And that's also always very surprising to me that in Miami, that, for example, the University of Miami's Cuban Heritage Collection has not undertaken a more thorough oral history of just kind of ordinary people. They've done some good oral histories, I think, of community leaders and trying to document that, that rise, especially the economic kind of rise of the Cuban community there in Miami. I think now they're finally starting to go beyond that. But I just wanted to point out kind of how special this collection is and how useful I think it will be for historians, given all these kind of politically restrictive contexts of producing oral histories in other places. And I apologize for coughing constantly. I'm sure I'm driving everybody crazy.
One more?
Yeah.
I'm not an historian, but I knew Liz and John for a long time. And I know that Liz started out, as Rachel just said, with a different understanding of what this Cuban Revolution was from what she ended up with. And that leads me to this question about choices that are made of which narratives to use. And Flor, I wanted to ask you, you listened to them all. There is and you said, and I'm sure it's true, that there's a very great range of views among this 111 people on all these different questions. But did you find a center of gravity that you would say characterizes the views of these 111 people? And is this book a representation of that center of gravity, or is this choice something else that is reflected, that Liz brings to it, that is shaping what she is picking out? Because I know that she ended up in a very different place from where she started.
Thank you for the question. Do I answer? Okay. Thank you. It's a good question because that happened to me as well. What happened to Liz happened to me as well. When I went into the archives and started listening, I had an idea. I had to say this: I'm Argentinian, I'm a Marxist, and being a Marxist and an Argentinian means that even though I'm not a Cuban specialist, I know a little bit about Cuba. I'm obliged to. It's kind of like the mandatory. But I had an idea of what I was going to find in the archives, and the archives responded in a different way. So to answer to your question about the center of gravity, I think she took the narrative that she took was from younger people, as was mentioned before, as Maria mentioned. And this is very important because the people, the older people pretty much said that what's on the contrary of what's said in the book. And I think the center of gravity has to do with that, like a polarization that has to do with age. When you listen to the older people, they are trying to discuss what life was like before the revolution, for example, and how their very own life changed because of the revolution. And people that are younger in the interviews, they always talk about, they always have criticisms. They always have critics that maybe the revolution didn't think about because it happened a long time ago, and we had to think about the fact that it happened a long time ago. So I think that the book only takes one position or let's say a few positions, but at the same time, it has to do with age, most of all, and it has to do with also, I think, race and gender. So all those things, and I don't know if I'm answering to your question, but I think that all those things shift the position of different people, and also I can tell that Liz's position was changing as well, because the question started to change while the interviews were being conducted. Because there are some people, for example, that she interviewed in 2005, and then she interviewed them in 2012. And the questions that she started asking at first were not the same as in 2005, then in 2012, and then in 2015. So I think that keeps on changing, and I think it has kind of like a her inquiries are changing as well. I don't know if I'm answering, but
Oh, Matt. Oh, sorry. You got the mic, so you get to go first, and then we'll hear from Matt.
Actually, I have two questions. One is, if you were doing it, would you have chosen the same 7 people? And secondly, I really wonder if anyone is thinking of doing a documentary film, because I would love to hear the voices.
I think you can hear them. You can hear them audio on
Yes.
the website. Yeah, so
Yes,
you
yes,
can actually
you-
listen to
you
the
do.
stories.
You-
Matt.
My mother was fiercely honest. Towards the end of her life, she made a major point of being very, very direct with people. With me or with other people, and I feel like her work, is her interpretation of the work. I feel like she was fiercely honest. She was a big supporter of the revolution. Even as she was writing this book, even towards the end when she was writing a critical book of it, she was not. In the UK anyway, we have a Cuban solidarity, the kind of just whitewashes, everything is rosy and beautiful and perfect. And she said, that's discrediting these, 10 million people. That's discrediting the people that have lived through this, time. And yes, there are wonderful parts of the revolution, but she wasn't going to write another propaganda book about all the wonderful things, that are part of the revolution. She was going to write a book that told the story of Cuban people of that generation. And that's what she did. We also got to remember that at this time, towards the end, there was major suppression by the government, still is. There's protesting happening in Cuba. Those people from protests that were being put in prison for simply going into the street and protesting the government. However you want to, say about those protests, it wasn't some, there might have certainly been some outside elements supporting it, but there were a lot of Cuban people that were in the streets protesting the government. And she was very sad to see the government cracking down very, very hard on that. She was a socialist, that's who she was. And, I think that we can agree that every single country, has their a critique of that country. No country, whether it's socialist or otherwise, should be considered in one simple thing. And that's certainly not how she wanted to present it, as one simple thing. It was very kind of, colorful spectrum, and she wanted to present it as that.
Thank you, Matt. And I encourage you to read the book, and I would say focus. It helps, when I talked about how there's 3 books, you can see how she gives the mic to the 7 Cubans and they tell their story. But she also takes the mic and she has her story to tell. And it's partly this story of kind of falling out of love with the revolution, but falling in love with the Cuban people, maybe. I mean, that's maybe simplistic, but I think that because, the conclusion, even though it's like 1 or 2 pages long, she speaks directly to the crackdown in July 2021 and the fact that the government has lost its legitimacy. And so now it uses fear and repression as a way to maintain control. I mean, and so she says that, like you said, very honest, very direct. This is her take on what's going on, right? And this is someone who has a history. Let me just speak quickly to some of the things that were raised that were really interesting. The choices that she made, only she can explain them in total and detail, but they had a price attached. And remember, as I mentioned in my presentation, she developed deep collegial friendships with the people she worked with. And almost all of them wrote her and say, don't put my name on your book. Either because they disagreed with the story she was telling, the title of the book, or they agreed with her, but they couldn't say so, right? That must have hurt. And that was very brave of her, to try to tell the story that she heard at least that generation of Cubans telling her. And I'm in contact with some of the people, and I'm interested to find out more about that. But there's certainly stuff that happened there that, is a private thing between them that she very kind of like with her dignity, she doesn't air any of that in the book. She hints at some of it, but she doesn't like, criticize anyone for the choices that they decided to make, right? Which is interesting and commendable. Another thing that's important, I think, to point out is that there is an archive, but there's also a slew of other things, books and other things that have already been published from the research. So Carrie Hamilton published a book called Sexual Revolutions in Cuba that was also based on this project. She was part of the project. And there's a team of 4 Cuban researchers who were part of the team that did the research. And they have a book, I think it's called Aires de la Historia. And all of this information and links to this stuff is on the website that Liz set up at her university. And it has links and descriptions of who was on the team, the things that they've published, right? And it even has actually a whole long, very boring, like 50-page methodology document that the team put together to describe what they were going to do. Now, maybe they threw it in the trash and they improvised because it didn't work, but they certainly spent a lot of time on that. Lastly, what I wanted to do is share one thing from one of the team members. As I said, I'm in contact with some of the people who were interviewed and some of the interviewers. And one of the interviewers is an old, dear friend of mine, a brother of mine, really, a Cuban brother of mine. And when I told him about the book and the event and et cetera, he said, "Qué bueno fue un trabajo de muchos años con Liz y estuvimos en Inglaterra y Cuba con ella realizando trabajo de campo y debate. Fue una buena experiencia." How good it was, the work of many years together with Liz. We were together in England and in Cuba with her, carrying out this work, this field work and debate. It was a very good experience, right? That was from one of the team members, right? One of the, Pavel, who's not Pavel, but that's the name that she uses to identify him, I've been in very close contact with him because he's also an old friend. He's a dissident and independent journalist, and he knows Liz's politics, and he only had good, positive, honorable things to say about her because how she treated him, how she respected his opinions, his voice. And remember, he was included because Liz was friends with his mother of a generation, but Liz was listening to his story, not the mother's story, right? Because his story was the one that she thought needed to be told. Do we want to hear a few more questions? We're about 5 minutes until we turn into a pumpkin here, even though Halloween's not here yet. Eloise.
Oh, hi. I would just like to say that when we say the Cuban Revolution, there is more than one Cuban Revolution, even when we're talking about 1959. We have 3 major organizations, and each one of them had a left wing, a right wing, and a sort of moderate middle. And the same is true throughout Cuban society. So we tend to want to make little sharp distinctions. And so we have this monolithic term, the Cuban Revolution. And I just want to, I don't know how many of you here are familiar with all of the history, but I just want to raise that one simple point.
Thank you. Thank you, Eloise.
Yeah.
Time. Hi, I'm Sophia Vasquez. I'm a second generation American Cuban, actually. And so it's really been an honor to be here and hear from all of you. And I have 1,005 questions. I'm a PhD student at Teachers College. I am wondering, and this can come from anyone, including the kids. That you're not kids, you're full-grown adults, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Okay, get up. If you were thinking about all of this data and all of these voices of Cuban people, where would you take this project next if you were able to use this research, right? I don't even want to say use, I don't like that word, but like honor it and honor Liz and the work that she's done. What jumps out to you as this is what needs to be done with this work next? Anyone can answer that.
I would just say quickly that themes that she clearly cared about but didn't get a whole lot of time to investigate more deeply were inequality, racism, and sexual diversity. And the people she chose spoke to those, but there's clearly a lot of material where, you know, and I really liked your comment about Rosa and Lázaro, because again, there's not one Cuban revolution and there's not one LGBTQ Cuban experience vis-a-vis, you know, the revolution or the support from the government or the monopolization of that dialogue or that discourse by the government, right? So I think that's what I would say.
Just a tiny thing. This is something that Liz was not planning on doing, but she asked a lot of questions about this. And I think that research on Santeria and Afro-Cuban religion, you have a lot of things to say. I mean, in the archives, there's a lot of things about that. And I think that that would be amazing, a project on that.
All right, John?
Yeah. Can I do my promotion? For a
Yes,
sec?
you
Okay.
can. John is going to do a little ad for a future event. Go for it.
On Monday, the 23rd, at the American Irish Historical Society, if you look at the green flyer, take one, I will be talking about the connection between Irish and Cuban nationalisms in the 19th century in New York in particular. And I know we're going to get a lot of Irish people there. I hope we get a lot of people there who are Cuban or have Cuban experience. And the Center for Cuban Culture is co-sponsoring. So I'm hoping that will bring some people there. My comment, and I'm just thinking about it because in the first section, when you said her reaction was that Cuba had lost its socialist soul, the people that I know in Cuba, and I'd be interested in having to look at the interviews, but the people I know would say it stayed too socialist in the sense of being centralized and resisting the energies that are part of Cuban people, whether they're farmers or small tradespeople or tour guides who want to be private. I mean, there's the frustration that I'm experiencing when I talk to people would say that it's still too locked in to its past. And that sort of raises for me, the problem is everybody, myself, and obviously the author and everybody else brings their own sense of what this poor little country of 11 people sitting under us.
Or very proud country, be careful.
How it ought to be. And obviously the government and the party have their vision of what it ought to be. And I think the question that I'm really posed with is what gives Cubans the freedom to actually figure out what they want to be. And that comes back ultimately to removal, I think, of the embargo and allowing a full engagement, at least from our side. They may have to go through a struggle about how much freedom they're going to allow in return. But I think from our side, we could make it a much more open situation than we are right now.
All right, thank you, John. We are out of time, but I have one more, and then I have one final thing to say, and then we'll all go out and find a place that serves wine.
I
the question that I wanted to ask is, this is an author who is no longer with us. And my question is, for those of you who know this project well, do you think that the evolution of titles ending up in this somewhat pessimistic title is one that you would have made if you had been given by some editor the responsibility of, now that you've read this, now that you've seen the interviews, would you call it this, assuming that the author had not herself settled in any one title and you had to give it a title? Do you think that this was a wise choice of title?
Maybe Rachel, I don't know if you have any insight into the title, but I'm sure, I mean, honestly, I come across things about Cuba, books about Cuba a lot, and then I click on the next thing. When I saw the title, and then the author was described as a socialist, I was like, I've got to read this book, because it's clearly a book about her journey, even though it's about Cuban Voices, right? Because her journey is someone who supported the revolution and criticized the United States, but then she went to Cuba to hear Cuban stories and she heard something surprising. But do you have any insight into the final title? Oh, you do, okay.
I know it came very late in the process. I don't remember that we talked about it, but I do remember saying to my husband, that's a weird title, because it does cast such a negative hue on the whole, the whole book. And if you don't know her background and you don't know who she is.
Yeah, they're going to be having a party about it in Miami next week, I heard, the whole book, yeah.
So I don't know if it came about because of the very last minute negotiations with a publisher with whom she was not expecting to give her work to. I'm not sure. That's why it would be interesting to know if you guys know anything, but I do know that it was a last minute thing and I wished I had time to talk it over with her.
Do you guys want to add anything or share anything? You want to give them the mic so we can get that, everybody can hear it?
It's very quick. The book had no title, or had a different title for a long time. My mother grappled with this title. She thought very carefully about this title. And I think it was the editor who we haven't mentioned, Will, and I'm embarrassed to say I forgot his surname. He's actually the reason why this was published. He found a publisher and helped her for next to nothing to edit it and get it into the shape it was, that we see it now. He's Will Lang, was it? Anyway, he's a tremendous man and neighbor. But anyway, the point being is that title was very well, thought out by her. It was not something that she just, it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. I think she really felt like that was the sum of the book.
I think she knew that it was going to be used by the Miami right. In fact, one of the first, and we talked about that, one of the first reviews that came out was in the Telegraph. I don't know how familiar you are with UK. The Telegraph is pretty right-leaning, and the Telegraph was like, yes, finally, we've got a socialist saying that communism sucks. And I think she had anticipated that would be the reaction. And of course, she hoped to be around to give a nuanced reflection on that. And again, I haven't read the book, but I will, and hopefully the book offers some nuance around all that. At least that was her.
Well, I should have saved one of the copies for you instead of my
No,
students.
I have them. That's not the issue.
We'll let the announcement. But I think I really like the title because it hits you and it gets your attention, and I think it accurately reflects the story that she heard from this generation of Cubans, or at least the 7 that she included in the book. They're very diverse, but they're all basically talking about living in an experiment that has fallen apart, right? And they're not all happy about it, but they're all dealing with it, right? That's my take. Announcement, and then I have a final announcement. Yeah. You take that.
Okay. No. This has been the great launch event for the fall activities of the Bildner Center. But I want to plug that tomorrow night we begin our series, a retrospective of the great Chilean documentarian Patricio Guzman. Tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the Siegel Theater, we'll be screening The Pinochet Case, which is his documentary about the legal capture of Pinochet when he was in London. And so this continues the tradition of the Bildner Center of our engagement with, the relationship between the arts, scholarship, and Latin America. We'll have two more of Guzman's documentaries, his chronicle of the Chilean struggle for democracy coming up. But tomorrow night is The Pinochet Case, 6 o'clock, Siegel Theater. Thank you, Bildner Center, for all the wonderful things.
You can tell that Jerry is often on television. He has that great voice, right? So the last thing I'll say is there is a part 2 and a part 3. This is a series, so stay tuned. We'll be in touch about the next event. It will probably be focused on the issues of inequality and racial discrimination, okay? And it may be spatial discrimination because of the issue about migration within Cuba. The last thing I want to say is we were talking about the title of the book. When I made the poster for tonight, I made 3 copies. One is going to be housed here at the Bildner Center, and I have one for Matt and one for Rachel. Okay, so come and get your prizes, and thank you guys very much for coming.